In the modern world, cities rise like monuments of progress, glass towers reflecting sunlight over endless streets of movement and ambition. But beneath the surface, another reality grows in silence, a slow fracture forming between those who move through the center of prosperity and those pushed toward its edges. In the distance, wealth concentrates upward, while entire neighborhoods begin to thin out, like air being pulled from a sealed room. At first, nothing appears broken. Transport still runs, lights still turn on, markets still open. Yet something invisible begins to shift in the rhythm of urban life, as if the city itself is quietly forgetting how to hold everyone inside the same future. And no one fully notices when balance begins to disappear. Before the rupture, these cities functioned as living organisms, driven by constant motion. Workers filled trains before sunrise, offices lit up in synchronized schedules, and commerce flowed through tightly connected systems that depended on every layer of society. The wealthiest districts expanded upward and outward, while older zones carried the weight of density and aging infrastructure. Still, there was a sense of order, even if uneven. People adapted to distance, to long commutes, to rising costs that slowly reshaped where life could be lived. The system appeared stable because it continued to move. But movement alone does not guarantee balance, and beneath this organized rhythm, pressure was accumulating in ways that were not yet visible on the surface of daily life. In the everyday experience of the city, inequality did not announce itself loudly. It appeared in small decisions repeated millions of times. A family choosing a smaller apartment farther from the center, a worker spending hours in transit just to remain employed. Streets that once held mixed communities, gradually shifting into zones defined by income thresholds. Cafes replaced local shops, housing prices detached from wages, and essential services drifted farther from those who needed them most. Life continued, but with increasing friction in every direction. The city still functioned, yet it began to feel heavier, as if every movement required more effort than before. And still most assumed this was simply the cost of modern progress. The early warning signs were not dramatic events, but patterns repeating quietly across time. Emergency rooms began to see longer waits from overcrowded districts. Schools in poorer areas started to lose resources at a steady pace. Transportation systems became overloaded at peak hours, revealing how dependent the entire structure was on those with the least security. Meanwhile, wealth concentrated into fewer zones, creating isolated pockets of stability, surrounded by expanding instability. Economists recorded the data, planners adjusted models, but the lived reality continued to drift further away from solutions. By the time the indicators formed a clear picture, the system had already entered a stage where correction required more than adjustment. It required reversal. As pressure increased, the city began to respond in ways that deepened the divide. Security expanded in wealthier districts, while surveillance increased in poorer ones. Housing regulations shifted, often unintentionally pushing vulnerable populations further outward. Public spaces became fragmented, no longer shared equally, but segmented by access and cost. The illusion of cohesion remained visible from above, yet on the ground, boundaries became sharper. The city was no longer a single continuous environment, but a collection of overlapping realities that rarely intersected in meaningful ways. And beneath this separation, resentment began to form, not as a sudden eruption but as a slow accumulation of unresolved tension embedded in everyday life. The critical turning point rarely arrives as a single dramatic collapse. Instead, it begins with failures that appear manageable in isolation. A transportation strike that lasts longer than expected, a housing spike that displaces thousands more than predicted, a financial downturn that affects the most vulnerable first, then spreads outward in delayed waves. Each event on its own seems recoverable, but together they reveal a system operating with no margin for error. The city, once perceived as resilient, begins to show how tightly interdependent every layer has become. And when one layer weakens, the effects do not remain contained, they propagate through the entire structure like cracks spreading through glass under pressure. Eventually, the system reaches a point where failure is no longer theoretical. Services begin to degrade simultaneously across multiple districts. Power grids strain under uneven demand. Housing instability reaches levels that overwhelm support structures. The city does not collapse in a single moment of destruction, but rather transitions into a state where normal functioning becomes inconsistent. Some areas continue with relative stability, while others experience persistent breakdowns. This uneven collapse creates a new form of geography, defined not by distance, but by access to survival itself. And within this fractured landscape, movement becomes uncertain, as if the city is no longer one environment but many disconnected fragments, sharing the same name. For those living within the most affected zones, daily life transforms into constant adaptation. Routines that once felt predictable become fragile. Access to water, electricity, transportation, and safety begins to fluctuate. Communities form temporary networks of support not out of choice, but necessity. Markets appear and disappear depending on conditions. Information becomes as valuable as resources, as people try to navigate a city that no longer responds consistently. Meanwhile, those in protected areas experience a different reality, often detached from the full scale of disruption only a few kilometers away. The separation between these experiences becomes so pronounced that the idea of a single unified city begins to lose meaning entirely. As instability deepens, institutional responses struggle to maintain coherence. Policies designed for stable systems fail under uneven conditions. Emergency measures address symptoms but not structure. Coordination between districts weakens, and communication gaps widen. The city's governing framework built for continuity finds itself managing discontinuity instead. Decisions that once required planning now require reaction. And in this reactive state, inequality is no longer just an economic condition but a logistical one, determining who receives assistance first and who must wait in increasingly uncertain conditions. The system continues to operate, but in a fragmented rhythm that reflects its internal imbalance. Over time, the consequences extend beyond infrastructure into human relationships. Trust between communities erodes as competition for limited resources intensifies. Migration within the city increases, but without clear direction or stability. Families become separated not only by distance, but by circumstance. Education, employment, and safety diverge so sharply that shared experience diminishes. The city still exists physically, but socially it begins to dissolve into isolated clusters of survival. And within this transformation, inequality ceases to be a condition that can be measured purely in numbers. It becomes something lived daily, shaping perception, behavior, and expectation in ways that are difficult to reverse. In the long arc of this transformation, the most significant impact is not only the breakdown of systems, but the redefinition of what a city represents. Once seen as a space of collective opportunity, it becomes a landscape of uneven access, where proximity no longer guarantees connection. Historical analysis reveals that these shifts rarely occur suddenly, but through accumulated decisions made over extended periods. Each policy, each economic adjustment, each infrastructural choice contributes incrementally to the final outcome, and by the time the full pattern becomes visible, the original conditions that sustained balance no longer exist in their previous form. Eventually, what remains is not a complete collapse, but a changed reality. Cities continue to function in partial states, rebuilt around the fractures that once threatened them. Some zones recover faster, others remain permanently altered. The memory of what existed before persists, but unevenly distributed, like fragments of a shared past that no longer align into a single narrative. And in this new structure, inequality is no longer an emerging issue, but a defining feature embedded into the architecture of urban life itself. A reminder that collapse is not always an ending, but sometimes a transformation that continues long after the moment it first began.